This is My Village Experience. I'm your host, Mesa Saw. Welcome. Hi villagers, today we have Chelby and she's gonna tell us a lot about mental health, Muslim link, and so many subjects, and I'm so excited to have her today in the show. So hi Chelby, welcome in the show.
Thank you.
How are you today?
I'm okay.
How was your weekend?
It's been usual. It's just the usual. I just work on the website and prepare for my stand-up comedy and that sort of thing.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm going to get back to that at some point. So right from the top, 3 essentials, what would they be?
That's hard. That's actually really difficult. I mean, 3 adjectives. I mean, I guess it would be ENTP. I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna say ENTP. So for people who know Myers-Briggs, that's my Myers-Briggs 4 letters. And then resilient and resourceful.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what about the ENTP?
ENTP. So for people who are familiar with Myers-Briggs, so it's actually something that sometimes people use in business, but again, it's a bit of a pseudoscience, but there's some evidence to it. But it's based on it was developed by psychologists. To sort of say that people have kind of almost like a personality type. Yeah. But now the argument is that it looks like it does actually test something, but it's probably not personality. It probably has maybe to do with the way we interact.
Absolutely.
So ENTP stands for E is extroverted.
Okay.
N is intuitive.
Okay.
So I kind of make up my mind for myself. I don't really, I'll assess a situation and then make a decision internally on my own. And then T is thinking. So I often will use sort of a logic over maybe an emotional response. And then P is perceptive. So it means I don't, I kind of, again, will make decisions based on the situation. Absolutely. Versus this idea that there's only one way. So I put that out there because when I did my Myers-Briggs, and I've done it a few times, it really helped me understand the way I look at the world, but also why I get into conflict with certain people I get into conflict with. Because being an ENTP is actually very unlikely that you will be a religious person. It's actually based on the research they've done in it, because so many people have taken these tests. They found that ENTPs are most likely to be atheists. And it's partly because we're just, we're good debaters. We're able to play the devil's advocate. And we won't just take an argument at face value. We try to deconstruct it. So, absolutely. But I feel there's a lot of advantages to that. I think that it makes life hard in some ways, particularly as a woman, because actually there's less women who have that. And there's some evidence that we're more likely to be bullied by other women because it's a personality, it's a type that's very, people don't know how to deal with it. But I think it's from the kind of things I've been able to do, it's been really helpful, because oftentimes people think, oh, you see things from a different perspective, and it's not really that. It's simply that I just I don't take the perspective at the surface. I kind of examine it.
And what about the resilience?
Resilient, I mean, I think that's what other people say about me. I don't really know if I like that word, but it's often been said about me. And just because I've gone through a lot of things. Personally, I just think a lot of people don't have a choice but to be resilient. I think it's a weird concept. I find it's a word that's become really popular, but I feel like it's sort of just I don't know. It's a weird term. A lot. It's sort of you kind of have to be resilient or you die. But I feel it is something in terms of understanding my perspective, because again, coming along with not taking things at face value is when you're somebody who survived a lot of different things, like abuse or just really traumatic events, your perspective on the world too becomes very different.
Absolutely.
And so you learn to rely on yourself a lot more.
Yes.
So, and that's a good thing in some ways, but again, it's also something that can make it difficult navigating certain spaces.
Absolutely. And what about your 3rd essential?
Yeah, the resourcefulness. Well, that just comes from, when you grow up without very much money or means, you learn how to try to make things work without money. So I often find myself really frustrated when I'm with people who are like, oh, we can't do this unless we have funding. And I'm like, okay, if it's needed, then we have to figure out how to do it. We can't sit around and wait for funding. That's a very privileged thing to do.
Absolutely.
And it's very dangerous. I think it makes people trapped. And I think being resourceful is okay, well, it might not be the fanciest thing, but did we do what we need to do and make it work? So for me, I'm more focused on like I like a crowdfunding approach to life, where it's like, okay, I don't need to get a big thing of money from one person. I can get little bits of money from lots of people. And the same thing with like, okay, well, maybe I can't hire this person, but maybe there's somebody who can volunteer to do this. And it's just why it's important to know so many different people, because the truth is we have so many people who have different skill sets, but we don't connect them enough.
The human connection, as mentioned earlier. From there, about your background, where are you from?
It's interesting. So I'm born and raised in Ottawa.
Okay.
So I've actually I've lived in the house I lived in since I was 5. So I've lived there for almost 35 years. And but my mother's French Canadian, German American. So I was raised in English, but kind of culturally I would identify as French Canadian.
Okay.
But
are you fluent in French?
I wouldn't say that to a French speaker. I mean, I understand it, but I was raised in English, and I wasn't put in immersion because for like again, there are interesting structures like around who gets immersion and who doesn't. So you find like a lot of people in my neighborhood are actually of French Canadian origin, but they didn't put their kids in immersion because for like class wise, like socioeconomically, you weren't permitted, or like those programs weren't offered to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in Ottawa, very much active French immersion is very much about social class. And so you have a lot of people who can speak French, but they don't know anything about French Canadians, and sometimes even don't like French Canadians and have this weird idea, like issues with the accent. Whereas for me, like I identify as culturally French Canadian because like I know that history. You know, if I interact with French Canadians and they see my name, it's very interesting the reactions I'll get, because it's a very it's a very French Canadian name. It's distinctly, it's a very Acadian name. So there's a whole genealogy to it, and so that's an aspect of being French Canadian. I think it's important for people to understand, is that like we're people, we're complicated people, and a lot of people don't like us because we're so different. We're like colonizers who got colonized. But it's important to understand, like, again, this whole drive to be bilingual had a lot to do with trying to like overcome the two solitudes, which were cultural solitudes more so than linguistic. And I would argue that like as much as we've been working on the linguistic side, we've not really worked on the cultural side. And so, and then my father's Nigerian, but again, like, I mean, for anyone who's African knows, it's like, what does that even mean? So like, because Nigeria is such a huge country, so much diversity. Absolutely.
Like a lot of countries in Africa.
Exactly. I mean, the borders were made up by some random, you know, British people or French people. And like, in the case of Nigeria, it was just because they didn't want to have, like, they should have made 2 states. They didn't want to have more than one governor general. They couldn't be imaginative to come up with another name. So you have Niger that's just like colonized by the French, and then you have Nigeria, and so then when you actually like, they're both the same name. It's ridiculous, and it's just named after Niger, which they named that because it was black. Like it's a ridiculous thing. So, but what's interesting is that my father, I didn't actually grow up with him because he was deported when I was like around 1 year old. And I didn't really know much about him because contact was cut off, really, unfortunately. But then, just out of curiosity, when I started learning more about Nigeria and realized it wasn't a thing, like there wasn't a Nigerian language. There's not like, it's all these different things. I was like, oh, I should try to find out what my father's ethnic group was. And so I went to the Nigerian High Commission, and then it ended up becoming this whole thing because it ends up my father's last name. Everyone who has that last name is related.
Okay.
It's a very distinctive last name.
That's how it works most of the time.
Well, no, there's actually a whole story behind it. So it ends up, the last name, I never pronounce it right, but it's Oniye Mofe, and it's actually not a name, it's a sentence. And the reason why everyone's related is because it was actually the name that my great grandfather, when he became a Christian, he took the pet name that his mother had given him, and his mother had been a slave. Okay. So to honor her, he took on the pet name she gave to him. And what's very interesting about it is that like she was a slave from a different ethnic group. Okay. So my father's family is Ija, which is an indigenous community from the Niger Delta in southern Nigeria. But my great grandmother's mother was Yoruba. Okay, yeah. Yoruba. And even at one point, he tried to find her people. Like she was taken as a child, and he tried to find her people, but he wasn't able to. And like it looks like they were from Ejebe Ode. And so it's a very interesting origin story. So that's why we all have this last name, and then like that story. And again, so what happened was that like a woman who was sort of in Ottawa at the time. My father was in Ottawa. She's like, oh, I recognize that name. And so it's a very long story. But anyway, through like just her talking to one of her friends who ended up being friends with my father, who had seen my father like 10 years previously. He randomly ran into him in Lagos. Then he's like, oh, I'm going to go back. I'll go back to like the street corner I ran into him in. And again, like, you understand how huge Lagos is.
Yes, of course. That's
so random.
That's so random. Yeah.
So then he went there, and then like there was a Malam there. So like Malams are generally Muslim, but they're the money lenders. Like they trade the currency. So the Malam there actually was the one who was like, oh yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Okay.
And then he's like, oh, I see him at the market sometimes. So then like within a week he was able to find my father.
Okay.
And then that's how I reconnected with my father. And so then through that, it was a whole kind of like, oh, this whole story I've been told about my origins was not really what was true. And he had all these documents. He'd been trying to find me. Like, it was a very sad, complicated thing. But so then I actually was able to crowdfund like about 10 years later to go see my father in Nigeria in 2012, which was a big deal because at that time, the president of Nigeria was from our ethnic group.
Okay.
Which was a big deal because like our ethnic group is like a pretty marginalized group. Like, we're the group that... Our ethnic group was a group that was like blowing up oil rigs.
Okay.
Because it's pretty fascinating because you had Boko Haram that was doing stuff, and then you had our group.
And
that was
about what year was it?
This is like all around like 2012 when I was there. But that time there was an amnesty. So what's a really interesting thing when I was there though is that I learned this other aspect of the history with Boko Haram, which was that at one point part of Boko Haram wanted the same amnesty that my father's ethnic group got.
Okay, wow.
And instead, their leader was killed, and it just led to this whole thing. And so that there wasn't even really one Boko Haram. So at one point, I actually met with a woman, the executive director of a women's organization in Lagos, and she's like, "Oh yeah, I just come from meeting with Boko Haram." I'm like, "What do you mean you just met with Boko Haram?" She's like, "Well, we were in the north because like." Again, women's organizations in Nigeria just put anyone here to shame in terms of like the way like they use sort of that women like identity as women to try to bridge the differences between ethnicity and religion.
Absolutely.
To have common ground. So when they had been up there, they'd been planning like a demonstration of women against both Boko Haram but also the security forces. Because Boko Haram, of course, was displacing everyone and causing all these problems. But the security forces were like taking people's food and raping everybody. Women from both sides were like, y'all suck. Yeah. Y'all suck. Okay. Like, so they were bringing women together on that. And then through that, through the women, she was able to meet with like some people from Boko Haram and then sort of understood that there's like split, like sort of like, there was a Boko Haram that kind of probably had wanted to make some sort of conciliation. There's a Boko Haram that basically had become like mercenaries for hire. Yeah. And then there's like the really hardcore ideological Boko Haram. And of course, that's all kind of grown and caused all sorts of chaos. But anyway, what was interesting is that time I had a chance to meet the vice president of Nigeria. And it was all this sort of really fascinating stuff. Just because, and even though my father's very poor, like my father never rebuilt his life. He never remarried. And my family is pretty, like, he's poor by Nigerian standards. For somebody who speaks 5 languages and had university education and that sort of thing. He was just so broken from getting deported that he didn't necessarily rebuild his life. But because he's an elder and because he's seen as a very intelligent man, like all these people from the ethnic group kind of really love him. Absolutely, and so like when I was
contrary to here, then people rely more on what you have in your pocket.
Exactly.
Then
So it's sad because I mean it was a very it was a very sad experience because it's like what would have been like to grow up with him, and like also like I always tell people like from that experience of being like, okay, be careful who you have kids with. Because I think a lot of times women think, oh, I can fix him. I'm like, no. You're going to have a kid that's going to be like that. Because the fascinating thing, I meeting my father is realizing like I am basically just the product of my mother and my father. There's things with like about my father that are so similar, but there's nothing like their personality traits or their interests or their worldviews. They have not like they would seem like nurture, but it seems almost like a genetic thing. So you're like, oh, be very careful who you have kids with.
Absolutely.
Because my father's attitude towards religion is incredibly open. Like he is Catholic now. He's gone through 6 different denominations of Christianity, Catholic twice. But he had no problem with me being Muslim because he went to a Muslim high school because it was cheaper than the Christian one. and that's just normal in the South.
It's
like that,
no problem.
That's the thing. Like, and again, also like that was the thing that really struck me, and it's been really struck me right Nigerians, and it's something that really frustrates me sometimes when I interact with the Muslim community or Christian communities here. I'm like, everyone acts like, oh, we're so open here that like Muslims and Christians talk to each other. I'm like, that's everywhere in Africa.
Yeah, basically.
Like in Africa, people are part of the same families.
And just what you mentioned, my mom actually went to a Catholic school basically most of her life.
That's a lot of
she has a Muslim name.
I know there's Catholic schools across the Muslim world.
Yeah, and people actually sometimes even go there
particularly they let you sell their daughters there too. Like even in Pakistan, all these places. But also again, like particularly in southern Nigeria, particularly in a lot of these places, like there's a lot more. I think also a lot of people don't realize in a lot of these countries, there's actually a lot more freedom of religion. Again, it's regional, but like missionaries are everywhere. You have every missionary you can think of. So people can move through different denominations of Christianity. You can move between Islam and Christianity pretty easily in lots of countries in Africa.
Yes, exactly.
And so we have much more to learn from a lot of African countries than we do to learn from here. So I always find that really frustrating, like interacting with so many people, because even again for a lot of Muslims, I realize like a lot of Muslims come from countries where like the dominant group is just Muslims, so they also don't really understand or relate to, or sometimes even I think they look down on like African Muslim communities, but it's like it's because we interact with everyone else.
Absolutely.
Like, you're the ones that are kind of weird, being all like 100% you're one thing, right? And I think you'll find that true for like Ethiopians or Eritreans or whatever. There's like we're used to interacting with different religions. You all need to chill.
Exactly. Yeah, you need to.
And we've been doing. Remember the time when like you guys fled and then like the king of Ethiopia let you come in? We've been doing this for a while. You all need to chill. So it's very. So that side too has been interesting, and then recognizing also being indigenous, like, so my father, like our family, like, because the Ija have only become Christian, some Ija are Muslim too, but Ija have only become Christian really recently, so there's still a lot of knowledge about our indigenous traditions and our origin story. So like every Ija child, so even like my original birth certificate, my name was different. My name is Chelby Tamara Ami Onyemofe.
Yes.
So every Ija child is given a name that has to do with the creator spirit. So it's depending on your dialect. My father's dialect is Shamara. Other dialects is Hoyengi. But that's a creator who's a goddess. And she created everything. And then there's like a pantheon. So there's like a warrior god named Ibesu, who's a god of justice. So a lot more, like, particularly my group is like really into Ibesu. My dad's like, you have Ibesu power. I'm like, how do you reconcile this with your Catholic faith? He's like, it's fine. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, there's no
overthinking it. He's a very big thinker. He just still thinks it's fine. So like, it's been interesting that too, because I think unfortunately, particularly for anyone who follows an Abrahamic faith, we often forget it's like, no, everywhere in the world had indigenous traditions.
Absolutely.
And often we think negatively about those traditions, and it's like, why though? Because a lot of times, like, we could disagree with it, but if you look closely, it's often still very much the idea of there's only one creator, and people just sort of, it's almost like if Allah, like the 99 names of Allah were personified by different things.
Absolutely.
That's really what's going on. Yeah. Ibesu's not an equal to
that's basically
Tamara.
what I understood too at some point,
right?
Learning around indigenous regions and spiritualities.
So it's important to understand, and also like it's our ancestors, right? So like whether or not we follow or not, we still have to understand it's like this is our ancestors. So it's important to understand what our ancestors did and like
how they lived and all of
how they lived and what was important to them and how they lived with the earth, like how they lived, like our people lived on the water and like just. So I feel like that's been interesting too, just sort of being somebody who is, you know, a convert to Islam, but also recognizing like a lot of Muslim communities have to really know more about their specific histories and understand that, like, you know, like, because you'll have a lot of Muslims being here like, oh, it's so bad what they did to indigenous people. Like, you've done the same thing to indigenous people too. You're still doing it right now in Indonesia right now. It's actually happening. So like, shut up. Like, you know, like, just everyone understand, like, a lot of these problems are like human problems.
Absolutely.
And people will use religion to justify horrible things.
Exactly.
And, you know, in Canada, there's a bit more openness about talking about it, but the truth is this is happening everywhere in the world. Yeah. So don't feel superior. Check yourself, you know.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And growing up in Ottawa, what did you want to become?
I didn't have any ambition. So I think that's the thing to understand. Again, I think if I'd been raised by my father, it would have been different because my father would have been that immigrant kind of thing. Yes. But I think what people have to understand, for a lot of people here, there is no hopefulness about becoming anything more than you are.
Okay.
And I think that's something a lot of immigrants or refugees don't understand. And sometimes they look down on poor people here and think like, well, they have all this opportunity. Why are they not doing anything about it? But you have to understand, like, people are controlled here through their minds.
Basically, yeah.
So, like, the idea of even finishing high school wasn't something I was raised with.
Definitely.
It was a fluke that I finished high school. It was not something my mom expected. So, because I grew up on welfare and social housing, and, I still live in the same social housing house that I was born into. And it's not like, there's no idea that you're going to get out of that. So that idea comes a lot for refugees and immigrants. A lot of refugees and immigrants are like, you're going to, even if we're here now, you're going to be a doctor, lawyer, and engineer. But you have to understand, for a lot of white kids who grew up in poverty, or other racialized kids who grew up in poverty, that's never what you think.
Yes.
You're never going to be more than what you are.
Exactly.
And so
there's not that pressure of, becoming an architect or...
Yeah, no, but it's something, but it's also something akin to hopelessness. It doesn't even seem like it would be something possible. And so people think it's just laziness, but it's not. You just literally don't think these things are possible for you.
Yes.
And so it's actually kind of a learned helplessness that has a lot to do with the way in which, if you are dependent on social assistance, or even if you're working, right? A lot of people in my neighborhood, I would say the majority of people in my neighborhood are working people. But, they do seasonal work, or they do really, you just never think of more. You just never think more is possible. And so it's a lack of... So I feel like, for me, even the thing I'm most passionate with is sort of that type of poverty, that makes you feel like
you're not part of the society.
You're not part of the society. Because even I'll say that, immigrants will be like, oh, these people, it's their country. I'm like, I didn't really feel like it was my country. It had nothing to do with me being black. It was more just we weren't important politically. We weren't important. So, I mean, yeah, I think that's the thing to try to understand about poor white people is that, and particularly also now that, I would say a lot of times poor white people are being used around issues, right? White nationalism and that sort of thing too. They're kind of a pawn.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't help if everyone else also looks down on them too.
Definitely.
Right?
Definitely.
So there needs to be a real understanding of and even again with colonial history, you have to understand probably, I mean, I know at least in my case, my ancestors were very little too. If you look at French Canadians, I mean, those of us who stayed here were the ones who couldn't go back to France after the British came.
Yes.
We were the ones that, so it was just the church and a lot of illiterate peasants and farmers. So, well, not really, farmers. And we've never really been well off, right? Kind of generationally. So it's important to understand that in terms of trying to assess why are people doing these things? You have to understand the whole history of it.
Exactly.
And then fight back understanding that.
Absolutely.
And also why there's a bit of resentment, because I think oftentimes, immigrants come here and they do pretty well, but they do well because they had a plan.
Yeah.
If you go into anything with a plan and you work together,
it works better.
You're going to do better.
Yeah.
And then, people who are white look here and there's what, or even indigenous communities look here and why are you guys doing better than everyone else? And it's well, it's because white people and indigenous people have been broken in a different way. You didn't have a plan, and in many ways you weren't allowed to have a plan.
Absolutely.
I would argue.
Absolutely.
Right? So immigrants came here with a plan. They had those family connections that keep people together. And so I think it's important for immigrants to understand that, not to look down on these other people. It's because there's people probably in your homelands that would never get a chance to leave the country who are broken the same way. So it's instead to be maybe it's great I have these opportunities in society, but maybe the society is not as safe as it looks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what about Muslim Link? What led you to that?
Well,
and how did it happen, basically?
Basically, it actually has to do with my trip to see my father. So I was crowdfunding to see my father, and then I realized just actually going there and seeing how my father lived, I would probably feel very, I'd probably feel like I needed to financially support him, because he was older, he'd had a stroke. So I was looking at trying to, at that time I was working with the police and everything like that, but I was looking at I needed to have extra money just to send to my dad. And so I always was seen as a person who's really good at sharing information. So I was sent a job opportunity with Muslim Link, not because anyone thought I would take it on, but because they thought I would share it with everyone else.
Absolutely.
But something about it, when I saw it, I just had this feeling, and sometimes I get these feelings, and I've learned, unfortunately, when I don't follow them, that usually, it's bad. So I got this feeling that I was supposed to apply myself. And so then I did, and originally it was simply just to take care of the paper, because it was physically a paper originally, just for Ottawa, just to make sure the paper was distributed across the city, to make sure that people who had bought ads paid their debts and collected past debts, and then just to make sure the paper, all the articles would come together and be put together. That was it.
Okay.
That's all I was hired to do. And it was just because the person who did that, like, who was the owner of it, he was in Dubai. He was working in Dubai. So when I came onto it, like, I didn't really have any expectations of it. I never read the paper myself. It was kind of like, I looked at it like a yearbook. Like, it was sort of just like only popular Muslim people talking about other popular Muslim people. Yeah. Right. Like, that's like the popular culture. Right no, it's even worse than that. Like, I would say I would say a lot of dynamics in the Muslim communities are like high school. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if you went to high school here, but just sort of like, it's like even your student government. It's like you don't feel that represents you, but like that's often what gets in the yearbook because you're just supposed to, like, it's not the whole community. So that's, and again, like, I converted at 22, so I'd already been Muslim for like over 10 years. And that's been my general assessment, is that, like, we have a huge community, a very diverse community, but there's no connection between sort of these self-appointed leaders and the rest of the community. But then when I started actually just like, and I don't really know why. I really feel this is just like, again, some things are just written. I started just looking through, and then I realized there was a website. And I was like, oh, there's a whole website. And then I realized it was built in this very interesting way. So the owner of it had built this website that had like an events listing and a directory listing, and then the thing for stories. But it wasn't being used. Yeah, basically. And the idea is like, oh, well, people put up their own things. I'm like, no one's going to do that. Our community doesn't do that. It doesn't work like that, basically. So then I just started just being like, I have this weird compulsion sometimes to collect things. So I was like, oh, I was like, why don't you teach me how to put things on this website? And so then, and no one had actually ever asked that before. No one had ever asked us to know how to do it themselves. And I was like, oh, just to teach me. And then so he taught me, and then through that I just started like populating the events listing, populating the directory. And then I was like, maybe I could just write stories or something. And then when I looked back, I was like, because I realized, like, financially he was putting all this money out of his own pocket to keep it going. And I remember thinking, like, why is he doing this? Yeah. And I remember, like, goal. What is his purpose? But then when I started even just learning more about Muslim newspapers, I realized that actually, like, a lot of Muslim newspapers are nonprofits. Yeah. And even those ones don't survive. So even across North America, a lot of Muslim newspapers have not survived. No, so I was like, well, so he's just trying to keep it alive. But the reality is that I realized, like, and then also, like, I thought it was run by really older people. Yeah, and they don't know much about the internet. And then it ends up everyone was younger than me. Yeah. So I'm like, why are you? And I was like, do your friends really? So I talked to the owner, like, do your friends read this? Like, my friends don't even know I own it. I'm like, why don't you tell them that? And so it was really interesting. So I basically was like, we need to make this something you want to read. Yeah, definitely. So I'm like, that's what we're going to do. So I just changed the attitude. I started populating with things. I started building up the social media. I started looking at what had been the most popular articles. And it was fascinating that the most popular articles had generally been ones that were of interest to the Somali community, which is a very large community in Ottawa. Absolutely. But which, because of systemic racism in the Muslim community, had not really been, like, properly engaged. And then again, oftentimes, even like you can see even with some of the articles that have been written, like articles written by the Somali community, or actually an old article that I was asked to write like a year before for Black History Month, those are really popular. Articles written about the Somali community, but in a way that like when you write a story, you have to think about the gaze. Who do you think your intended audience is? So I could see that some stories have been written about the Somali community, but they were not written. They didn't engage. Well, they wrote them as if they're writing for people who weren't Somali. Like, it's like it didn't even cross their mind that Somali people read this article about themselves. And again, these are trained journalists, but that's a problem too. Like, these are Muslim people too, and a lot of these are Muslim people who are like very critical of mainstream media. But I'm like, okay, but you're critical of mainstream media, but you're doing the same creepy thing. Exactly, you were working the same way. So a lot of is that I'd always had a history of doing facilitation on anti-racism, on anti-oppression, which is where like you look at the variety of ways in which people are marginalized, and in which you have privilege. So you have to go both, right? It's like I can be all like, I'm so marginalized, but it's like, but I also have a lot of privilege. Basically. And what was really interesting in sort of assessing that is realizing that there was like. And then also in the Shia community, which is a very large Shia community here in Ottawa, was rumored to be dumping the papers. Like, we drop it off their stores, and there's rumored that they were dumping it. I was like, could it be? And then I found out that we wouldn't do any stories about the Shia community. And that was a kind of unwritten policy. Exactly. And I'm like, okay, well, could it be that they know that and they're dumping it? It's like, well, I don't know how they know that. I'm like, I think they'd figure it out after reading it enough. So then, like, a lot of different things happened. So, like, eventually I was like, listen, for some reason, I decided I want to make this financially viable. Otherwise, it's not going to survive. And I think I can do this by just like making it relevant, not discriminating against anyone. Like we had a policy that like we would only publish photos of women if they covered their hair. So we'd even make advertisers cover their hair.
Which doesn't
and I was just like,
represent the whole community.
But then it was really hilarious because like I was able to make the argument because like, they were like, well, it's because we distribute at the mosque and that's why. I'm like, okay. Then they had Pauline Marois. They put her on the cover. And I'm like, why is she on the cover? And they're like, well, she's old, so it doesn't matter. I'm like, you guys are like, no, this whole policy. It's like, I would just freak out. And then they would just let me do whatever. And then like the biggest and sort of final fight was around, so the Shia Islamic school got number 2 in the city through the Fraser Institute report.
Okay.
And I was like, I'm going to do a whole story about it. And there was actually reluctance to let me do the story.
Okay.
And I was like, I'm going to quit. And at that time, like they really needed me. Yeah. So I was like, I'm gonna quit if you don't let me do the story. I can't. It's discriminatory. And then in the end, we did the story. And then one of my friends went to one of the Shia places that had been known for like throwing our paper, and the paper was right beside the cache. And he was so excited. And she's like, "Oh, you like Muslim League?" He's like, "I never thought they'd write about us." So it had totally been that. They totally knew we were.
And what did she say about that view of things?
Well,
why did she think
she knew about what I had been going through. So when she was basically able to be like, they're so look at how happy they are that you actually wrote about them. Definitely. Like, because that's the thing, right? And I've had a chance to sort of talk to Muslims who are interested in writing and journalism about this. It's like, listen, you have to understand that you're bringing prejudice with you. Yes. You can focus all you want. You can do a PhD about how prejudiced white newsrooms are, but you have to understand Muslims do the exact same thing. And if you look closely at Muslim media, even produced in North America, it does the exact same thing. It's anti-black racist. It's often anti-Shia, unless it's run by the Shia community. It's often anti, like, anyone who's not a doctor, lawyer, and engineer, which is not the majority of the community. They might want their kids to be that, but then they have to be personal support workers and daycare workers and drive taxis. So it's classist and racist and weird. And then also, or a lot of it's just like me talking about my friends. And that has to change. And I don't have a background in journalism. Like, I actually don't have a background in university at all. Like, I never graduated from university because of my mental illness. And so what was really interesting is that, like, it became more popular. We got more readership. Like, financially, it was becoming more viable. But then I started getting a lot of backlash. Yeah, definitely. But not from who you think.
Okay.
It wasn't from the uncles. It wasn't from that. It was from people who I think realized because ultimately what I started doing was sharing information. It was breaking down the gatekeeping of opportunities and information. So people learn about job opportunities. People learn about scholarships. People learn about things that honestly had been very much kept within a very select group of people and gave to their kids.
Probably,
right? Yeah. And this was now opening up to like tens of thousands of people. You know, because Ottawa is like tens of thousands of Muslims. And a lot of people did not want that. Because it's about being like, I'm the spokesperson for the community. I'm this. So that's the thing. Like the first people who really, really went after me were women who were probably identified themselves as being like open-minded and inclusive, but really weren't. And so, but again, like for all the hate I've gotten, and I've gotten a lot of hate, like I've gotten a lot of hate, but the owner of Muslim Link, he has to deal with the most of it because people just scream at him in Arabic about me, which I've literally witnessed. So disturbing. But he stood up because in the end of the day, he knows there's all these other people who really appreciate what I'm doing because like kids are getting jobs from it that otherwise wouldn't have known. People getting scholarships, people learning about events.
And it's really connecting the whole community.
Well, yeah, because people are happy if more people know about their event and then more people go to the event. Like at the end of the day, it's not, it's bringing the community together and allowing for people to communicate information. Like that's a positive thing. Yes. And I think ultimately anyone's going to have a problem with that as somebody who frankly is trying to control the community.
That's the thing.
And that's not cool. So... And it's been interesting doing Muslim Link because I'm also active in the Black community. And I realized like we don't have something like that in the Black community, and I realized like so many communities need a Muslim Link of their own.
Exactly.
Because and then what was really fascinating is like again we just started in Ottawa, but then I realized we just realized like just the amount of energy that was taking into doing the physical paper, we just didn't have it, and like we just didn't have the.
Takes much more resources.
Yeah, and we just focused on the online, and again it was so much easier to see the reward from investing that time. Absolutely. But also even for advertisers, like we can tell them how many impressions they got. Like if you put your ad in a paper, you don't even know people saw it. So we can show people impressions, clicks, that sort of thing. But then I realized, wait a minute, if it's online, it could be national. Yes. So we started just going into different cities. Like I started the Toronto events listing, which became incredibly popular, and then Montreal, and then so now we just added Regina. So I have events listings for now for like 14 cities across the country. And in the process, I've learned so much about Canada because again, I've lived my whole life in Ottawa, but the reality is Canada is not a very, we often talk about immigrants and refugees integrating, but the truth is Canada is not very integrated. It's very regional, and it's it's a big urban-rural divide. Yeah. So I've learned so much from like having to figure out like, oh, what's going on for Muslims in Halifax, what's going on for Muslims in Regina, and then you realize like what's going on in Regina, and you're like, oh, this is so different than the reality of Ottawa, and like the troubles that are happening there, the challenges economically, socioeconomically happening in those countries, like. But also, like, the demographics of Muslim communities in different cities is so fascinating.
And, so the more you go to the east or to the west, like, you have, like, so different communities.
And so, like, filling up the directory listings for that, filling up the events listings for it, like, I just learned so much. And it's so fun, really. But that's the thing, like, I do it pretty much almost entirely on my own. Like, the publisher helps with the physical website. But in terms of content, it's just me. So it's a lot of work. And now like I'm trying to figure out how to like eventually make it so that it's sustainable outside of both of us, like both myself and the publisher. Like how can we make sure this is rise? Because the truth is so many, like it's become so essential in some ways. And like that's like the last iLead conference that we went to, like it was so interesting because we had a lot of people who were from other cities just come up to us being like even some of the people who were bazaar vendors, like, oh, we found out, because we have a section for bazaar vendors. There's like, we found out about iLead from you. And we're like, oh, that's amazing. And then like we had people from Toronto being like, I'm just here from Toronto, and like, I just want to say, like, yeah, I like your thing. And then like we had some guy who just was new to the country. He's like, I love you guys. You guys help me find out different things. I'm like, this is like
that's the power of the internet, rather than, you know, as you mentioned, the paper that you cannot really reach all those people.
Well, yeah, because even also like the publisher of Muslim Link, he's invested so much in SEO so that like people don't even have to know about Muslim Link. They can just search something in Google, and then because we put it on Muslim Link, it becomes more accessible to find.
Absolutely.
So again, I feel like in the face of a lot of like the challenges of the Muslim community, what we're doing is kind of important because, you know, how do you, both because of dealing with loneliness, like I feel like loneliness is a very serious problem in the society, and a lot of people are coming and can be isolated.
Also in Canada, it's a huge thing.
Huge issue. And the reality is also with Muslim communities, like, yes, you can go to a mosque, but maybe you don't feel you fit into that mosque. So it's good to know there's other programming that might appeal to you. We can connect with other Muslims, or connect with non-Muslim things that are important to you. But then also like just learning about opportunities, learning about different things, but also just inspiring stories. Because that's the thing too. Like so some people had an issue with me because they're like, oh, you're trying to make Muslim Link mainstream. Because before it had a lot of stories about like international, like foreign policy and like problems like
about probably Muslim countries and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I sort of cut those out. And so people are like, oh, you're trying to make it mainstream. And I was like, no, I'm trying to make it more hopeful.
Exactly.
Because a lot of it was just really negative. And like, I'm not saying those things aren't real, but I'm saying like,
it's part of the truth, and it's all.
But also, I'm thinking like sometimes you can touch on those issues in a very different way.
Absolutely.
So, like for example, you know, when I do profiles of Palestinian community, all those Palestinian issues come into that. Yeah. But it's also about like, oh, you've made a career doing this, or oh, you're selling this. Like it's positive because, frankly, I feel also sometimes like I found a lot of times the people who want to write those negative things, they actually are well-off people, whereas like my neighbors are people who actually have family in those countries who are suffering. So when you have families in your country suffering, writing a hopeless piece about how negative everything is not something you want to do.
No, definitely.
You want to know that there's something to look forward to and that there's hope.
Yes.
So I felt like in some ways part of the problem is that people think negative means you're going to do something, and it's not. It means you're going to give up. If you're actually living through those things, what you want to know is that there's some hope, realistically.
Yes.
I think it's called critical hope. It's like, we know things are bad, but we also know that there's a chance that if we do certain things, we can do something. Yes. Or like you're telling me how I can take an action that can improve something. And that's basically how I do things now. It's like, it has to be, you can take this action, you can learn about this thing, or this person overcame this stuff, or this person's still coping with this situation, but you know, they're sharing their story, and that's resilience.
And talking about hope, can you get us back to July 2017? About
the suicide. Yeah, the suicide attempt. Well, I live with a very serious mental illness. I've lived with it. I was officially diagnosed when I was 15. So that's when I was officially diagnosed with dysthymia, which is a form of chronic depression. So I've never known actually, like there's a good chance, and a lot of us who live with this, we've never actually known what it's like to not be depressed.
Absolutely.
So they just often don't like to diagnose depression in children. But I had a lot of problems as a child, and so actually like was seeing a social worker when I was like 8 because I had all these like academic issues, but they realized that they were connected to a psychological problem. So it looks like I've probably been living with depression since I was a child. And a lot of it's related to trauma within the family I grew up in. And I think the reality we have to understand about suicide is that I actually think we need to understand it's actually a very normal response.
Absolutely.
To circumstance. And I would even argue to a certain extent, if you look at animals, a lot of animals commit suicide. They just do it in a very different way. I would argue they get depressed and then they isolate themselves and then they don't eat and then they die. And I think sometimes the world gives you certain messages. I think your brain responds by being like, oh, I'm supposed to die. Like, I'm really convinced of that now. I think some people will never cross their mind, but the reality is it's more likely it didn't cross their mind because they had these other things going on.
Other circumstances.
Well, actually, no. So there's a theory. There's something called the interpersonal theory of suicide, and what they found is that a lot of people can live with a very serious mental illness and depression and never think about suicide. So you can have very serious depression and never think about suicide. They found that people are likely to think about suicide if there's 2 other things going on. Well, there's 3. The original theory has 3 things, but the 2 aspects have been proven by other research. So those 2 aspects are if you feel socially alienated or lonely, and if you feel like a burden. So if you feel socially alienated and lonely, socially isolated, and you feel like a burden, those are the 2 things that'll probably push you to attempting suicide. And so that's why it's very important if you're doing any kind of suicide prevention to actually start understanding it's not just treating the depression.
Absolutely.
It's also because people can live with depression and never attempt or contemplate.
Because you mentioned at some point, I was reading one of your articles that you said that not everyone that attempts suicide has mental illness. And
yeah. I mean, it could be a very, I would argue that there's probably depression that's happened.
Absolutely.
But it could be a very acute, it could be over a very short period of time where something's happened and you're like,
internalized.
I need to leave now. And that could be the best thing. Like, I think, again, people commit suicide in very different ways.
Absolutely.
But a lot of people, I would say, who don't have a personality disorder, because that's another aspect of things. So people who are not doing it out of like revenge, which is more likely to happen if you have a certain type of personality disorder. They're doing it because they think it's actually going to make things better for everyone, which sounds very strange for, I'm sure, a lot of people. But but if you understand the social isolation aspect and the sense of being a burden, well, if I feel like a burden, then I want to stop being a burden.
Absolutely.
And so, like, my mother died by suicide, and she had attempted throughout my life. And I'm very convinced that she thought she was not being a burden. Absolutely. And she was very socially isolated. So that's why, for me, like, things like Muslim Link are so important, because both, like, having stories where people learn about people who are having similar problems as they are, or even just basic stuff like, oh, there's an event I can go to, because maybe I'm feeling really lonely at this mosque, but maybe if I go to this, paint night or this women's yoga thing, I'll find other Muslims that I'll fit in with.
Absolutely.
Because social isolation, alienation is such a serious problem. And it's a public health issue.
Absolutely.
Because not only can it affect your mental health, it can affect your physical health. And that's been proven scientifically. It affects your immune system. So it's very important as a community, whatever community we belong to, that we really start thinking about that. But we also understand that, like, and that's why even issues of like bullying, which again, we think it's a childhood thing, but I mean, people get bullied at work all the time. Like, it's just, we have to understand that those are sending very clear messages to people that push people over the edge a lot, because we're social animals. Like, we forget we're animals, but we're a very particular type of animal. It's like we're like dogs in a way, because if you look at any pack animal, they're very interdependent and they don't really know what to do on their own. Human beings are like that, because if you think about us, we're completely useless on our own.
You need a community.
You need a community. And so,
and it seems that we need at least something around 50 people around. Like,
well, we need lots of people. We need lots of people. Because again, also at the end of the day, like, you can be, again, it's that other side of being a burden.
Yes.
My mom and I just had each other, and it was too little for both of us. You need many more people so that no one becomes a burden to another person, and then both people get weighed down and drown. That's why it's simply like, it's sort of spreading the weight. And that's, again, it goes back to my crowdfunding view of life. It's like, don't have one person have to give you all the money. It's like, a lot of different people give you a little money, so it's not hurting anybody. We have to kind of be that way when it comes to social support. So that's why it's so important that we figure out how to keep up those bonds, because I would argue that, it's really hard. And it was an interesting thing when I would talk to my dad, because sometimes he's asked to mediate things because he's an elder, so he has to mediate things. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, the neighbors are having a fight, so I invited to come in, and then I have to mediate the dispute. I'm like, that's fascinating.
Yes.
But I'm realizing, like, oh, that's how people, like, stay together, right? Because again, a lot of the mediations for marriages, and it's also interesting too, because even like the issue of like domestic violence, like I mean, it's definitely a serious problem in Nigeria. But again, even talking to women who've come here as immigrants from other communities, you're like, he would never be able to beat me like that
if
the
the
way he can here, because everyone's going to hear, and no one minds their own business. Exactly. So someone's going to come in, whereas here it's like, well, I'm not going to say anything.
And
you're like,
you always take a step back because you don't want to, as you mentioned, like get into someone's life and trying to,
but the idea was sort of like, that's weird if you wouldn't get into someone's life.
Absolutely.
So like
in Africa it's definitely weird.
It's just like, what? But it also means you can cause problems, but you also can prevent a bunch of problems too.
You can go to jail.
Right?
It can go all ways.
It can go all sorts of ways. That's the problem with people. Like but ultimately, you can see how it's so important to have people not feel like it's not their problem. And I think definitely, there's a lot of things, like I identify as Western. Like I find that's another weird thing sometimes when I navigate communities, like, West, I'm like, I don't know how to be anything but Western. But at the same time, like I think there's a lot that could be said. So it's going back to what I was saying earlier about, like, immigrant families might do better because everyone's working together.
Yes.
That is something.
And the community is still, again, really present in their lives.
Yeah. So there's negative things to that, but I'm also like, there's a whole social safety net. There's a whole social welfare thing. Like, so we have to figure out a way of making sure that that's not toxic, but preserving it.
Yes.
And also rebuilding that for other white people and indigenous people. Because I'm arguing that, like, the breakdown, like, when I talk to people, like, you don't talk to your family. Like, I mean, in my case, like, I don't have any family. Like, my mom has passed away, my dad's in another country. But, like, for anyone else who does have family, I'm like, okay, unless they, like, abused you, why are you not talking to them?
Yes.
This is weird. And it's not healthy.
Definitely not.
So we need to figure out how to help people preserve their relationships, because number one, the state should be investing in this because it's going to save them money. Definitely. But like, you want to look at it from a taxpayer perspective. But it's also one of the things that gives a lot of newcomer communities an advantage. It's those ties that, again, mean that, you're not going to end up homeless because somebody's going to take you in. You're not going to end up, like, that's the reality people face here. It's like there's no one to take you in. Absolutely.
And would you say that it's part of the approach that you have towards mental health in general, or mental illness, as in a way of finding the balance between the community and even the choices that you take on your own?
Well, yeah, I identify as like a mental illness advocate because I'm mentally ill. So I know for other people it's about managing mental health, but I'm already ill, and there's not a cure. Like, it's sort of just how my brain works, and I have to manage it. I think definitely we have to understand that, yes, community sometimes can, like, I met Muslims, I met other people, like, their community is making them sick. Their family is making them sick. Yes. And the problem is that there's not a really viable alternative, though, because leaving the family won't necessarily be a good thing either, because the system is also not really healthy. So it's trying to figure out a way of, like, addressing the fact, like, when things go toxic and being aware that things can go toxic. And that's where, again, as a survivor of trauma, my perspective comes in, because I feel like a lot of people, unless you've gone through that, people are quite naive. Absolutely. And that's why, even for me, it's like, I am Muslim, I've been Muslim for 17 years, but I like being amongst people, I like being able to have the opportunity to study, but I don't join things. I don't join spaces because there's a lot of dynamics in those spaces that I find are potentially abusive. They might not be abusive, but they're potentially abusive. And unfortunately, when people are really in it, or like, unless you have that background, you can see it more easily than other people can.
Absolutely, yes.
And it's not a paranoia, unfortunately, because unfortunately there's just a lot of sociopathic people running around, and a lot of narcissistic people running around. So you have to be very careful. So I think we have to just always be mindful of, like, creating checks and balances so that abuses don't happen. Absolutely. Whether that be within family, whether that be within a religious space. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not about being paranoid, it's about being accountable. Absolutely. So if everyone understands that, like, yeah, you're a parent, but you're accountable for all your actions, you can't just hit your kid because you're angry. Right? Like, I mean, it's just like that, because that, you know what your intentions are. Yes. And that's most of we know what your intentions are. It's like, there's, this idea of discipline, and then there's, like, you're just really angry and trying to have a punching bag, but you're using your kid. Like, let's just be honest about that. Like, so, having those checks and balances are important. And that's why relationships are important, to kind of help us keep those destructive balances.
Absolutely.
Because that's another aspect of mental health and relationships that's interesting, that anyone who does sort of like family therapy, if a couple therapy, realizes that actually, like, oftentimes in the context of a couple,
yes,
you could actually deal with a lot of mental health issues.
Absolutely.
Because we want to relate
yes,
to each other.
The human connection.
Yeah.
Basically.
So you can actually improve a lot of your outlook. Like if you're always sort of being like, having these really negative thoughts and then expressing them, the other person like, this is a downer.
Dark. Basically.
Can you stop doing this? And like, you're going to be like, oh, I should, like, so a lot of people can improve if they have a healthy relationship. Absolutely. And given some tools, a lot of these ways of thinking that are actually quite destructive can be fixed. Not to say you can fix people.
Absolutely. That's another thing.
Again, it's more in the case of like just regular stuff. But it's important to understand that like a lot of the problems I think we're having right now in our societies are probably very much connected to loneliness, because that ways in which you would improve yourself aren't happening because you're completely socially isolated.
Absolutely.
And then even with social media, it's like, I think the reason why we're seeing social media so violent is because those checks and balances that we naturally have from a face-to-face with a person aren't there. No. I can say whatever horrible thing, and I've done it. Like, I've trolled my own friends, and then I'm like, wait a minute, why was I doing that? Like, our nature is to be very negative and aggressive, but often when we're seeing other people, and if we have basic empathy, we stop. But I don't see you on social media.
Absolutely. You don't see
and
the other person.
And you're like an object. And I can just put all my rage out there. So I feel like we have to all sort of be checking ourselves and being like, maybe you should get off social media right now and just do this. So like now for me, a lot of what I'm trying to do is just share something personal about myself and then share something like positive information. I'm no longer like, there's a lot of things I'm angry about, there's a lot of things I'm scared about, and I also don't comment. Like, unless I'm saying something positive, I never comment on anything. Because I know that, like, again, an aspect of depression that people often don't talk about is irritability. So the reality is a lot of people who are very seriously depressed, we often can come off as very irritable, very angry, very grumpy, very mean-spirited. But it's actually depression.
Absolutely.
Which doesn't mean we're not responsible for our actions. It just means, though, that like we have problems regulating our emotions. That means that other people can think the same thing, but they don't say it.
Exactly.
Whereas we're trying to, like, we're having... So that's the thing, too. Anyone says, like, it was my mental illness that made me put this tweet out. It's like, no. It was your mental illness that stopped you from having the ability to think before you put the tweet out.
Absolutely, yes.
Because you were impulsive and you didn't think straight. But it didn't put those ideas in your head. Your mental illness did not put those ideas in your head.
And would you say that the Muslim Link, like the work that you did there, would you take it as your most proud achievement? Or what is it, your most proud achievement?
I'll be honest, like, work with Muslim Link has probably helped me more than it's helped anyone else. It's given me a reason to wake up in the morning, because, like, definitely after my mom's death, I don't really know, like, there wouldn't have been any reason to wake up in the morning. And she died about a year after I started working with Muslim Link. Okay. So probably without Muslim Link, I wouldn't have gotten through that. And I didn't entirely get through it. But definitely working with Muslim Link has been, it's a thing that I do every day. It's a thing that keeps me going. It's a thing I can say, okay, you know, I might not have been able to leave the house today, but at least I put this stuff out there and somebody now knows about this opportunity.
Absolutely.
And help. So that's been very helpful for me. And I'd probably say to anyone else, like, you know, life is suffering. I think, like, a thing people understand is, like, there was always going to be suffering. Often what keeps us going is purpose.
Absolutely.
And so I do highly encourage people to figure out a way of finding a purpose. And I think a lot of people are trying to find purpose, but they just need to be honest about it. It's like, the reason why this is so important to you is because this is your purpose. So I feel we all need that. And I feel like that's sometimes what's lacking. And then people are, you know, really feel empty because they just don't have that. And so I feel like it's given me a lot of purpose. It's been very rewarding. And it's not my favorite job, but my favorite job actually was when I worked for 5 years in local high schools running a program for immigrant and refugee girls. That was my favorite job. And it's been great to maintain relationships with, and then also I always loved tutoring. So what I love is that I think when I don't like the word pride. I don't like the word proud, but I think what I'm grateful for is that a lot of kids I've known growing up, or I still know them. Right. And now I've had a chance to become like friends with them. Or like, I mean, I would say more like I'm a big sister. I got to see them grow up and they're still in my orbit. Because I feel like even though it's important to always have boundaries when you're doing that work, at the same time, it's also like, but live with people.
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
I believe it's good to maintain connections.
Absolutely.
And so I'm grateful that I've maintained so many connections. You know, like I'm still, you know, my two best friends are three best friends actually are my friends I made in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So it's been over 20 years of knowing them. So those are things I'm grateful for. I'm not really proud of anything. It's been neat to see how the way I think can be harnessed into something practical and productive and helpful. That is really neat. But I would argue that a lot of us have that. It's just we haven't been given the opportunity to figure that out.
Absolutely.
And I would argue there's a lot of people
or to express it sometimes.
Yeah. Yes. And that's why I feel like but again, also I think that's what's really cool about social media, in that there's a lot of problems with social media, but at the same time also like there's been a democratization of storytelling that has happened. So you have like people with very limited things like the internet and a phone, and they're able to produce all sorts of different perspectives and stories and things and which you never would have heard before. And that's awesome.
Absolutely. That's really
so, you know, and we're living in a bit of a troubling age because we have a lot of misinformation out there. We have like the rise of just hatred because everyone who hated people have found a community of people who also hate people. Now they don't have to feel alone in their hatred.
Yes.
You know, so it's like it's when community goes wrong. But we also have, like, again, with things like podcasts, with things like the fact you can produce so much with relatively small production. Yes, it's leading to, you know, this decline of mainstream media, which is very scary because it means that people are not getting their news from one particular source. But it also means that now there's all these alternative perspectives.
Absolutely.
That are great and that we need. You know, and it's so I feel like it's an exciting time for storytelling.
Absolutely.
And like the slogan for Muslim Link is community building through storytelling.
Oh, great.
And ultimately that's, you know, I want to be able to figure out how to do more of it. I want to be able to bring more people on into it. But I feel like the biggest thing we can do for Muslims in Canada right now, given everything we're up against, is be better at telling each other stories to each other.
Absolutely.
Non-Muslims read it too.
Yes.
But even my approach, like, because I'm trying to start a series about Islamophobia, but and that's, you know, I was talking to you earlier about like that would incorporate not only just like understandings of our negative experiences with Islamophobia here, but also how some forms of Islamophobia are connected to people's actual lived experiences with something negative in the Muslim majority world. And we're all together now in Canada, so there's chance for redemption and reconciliation, but only if we work it out. And we have the opportunity to do that through stories. But are we taking it up?
Absolutely.
So that's kind of the next sort of thing I'm seeing, if, you know, to work on, because I feel like because I've been waiting for somebody else to do it. I've been like, come on. Yeah. this can't possibly be, somebody else must be thinking about this.
Absolutely.
But it looks like I might have to bring some people in and get help and do it, because I feel like it's very important right now.
Absolutely.
And given whatever politically is going to be happening, it's going to be really critical that we start working on the issue of Islamophobia, but doing it in a way that is focused on working with people who've had negative experiences with Muslims, not just yelling at people and calling people Islamophobes.
Just staying in your corner, you know.
Yeah, and it's like, no, and also meaning you have to face certain things about yourself. Because personally, what I think the big issue we have all to deal with internationally is supremacy. Absolutely. So whether it be white supremacy or Muslim supremacy, I mean, I don't really know, how do you look at something like Daesh? You know, or ISIS, that's Muslims. Those are a bunch of Muslim supremacists. That's what they are. Exactly. Right? And if you look at the dynamics happening in Muslim majority countries, it's a lot of Muslim supremacy. If you look at what's happening in countries where they're persecuting Muslims, well, it's another form of supremacy, ethnically or religiously, that's trying to dominate things. But the bottom, you know, the denominator, the common denominator, is a supremacist narrative.
Absolutely.
And why is that rising? And how much does that have to do with the fact that people feel very uncertain with the world? And so instead of, you know, governments solving people's real problems, like if we look at what's going on in Quebec right now, I feel this whole push for basically really going after Muslim women. They're going to say it's everybody. It's like, really.
That's exactly my...
But I think it's a distraction. There's real serious problems in Quebec economically. But we can't fix that. But everyone's going to be happy because, look, we fixed this.
We fixed this.
And I think we have to understand, like, that's what we're politically dealing with right now. People are going to promise to destroy a bunch of stuff. to show that they can accomplish something because they don't want to or they can't do the harder work of giving people what they really need, which is like economic stability and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think like worldwide, it has right now, it seems that religion is the mainstream anything like to deal with rather than, as you mentioned earlier, rather than dealing with the real problem, real issues in the society.
But also, and also it's great too, right? Because again, if particularly if depending on your religion, you believe the end of the world's coming. Well, you know what? We don't need to figure out about your pension right now because the world's going to end before then. So let's make sure that Jerusalem's the capital, and so that Jesus can come back and everything's going to be fine. And as Muslims, we're doing the same thing too. It's like, oh, this is a sign. This is a sign. So don't worry about, we're never going to have democracy, but we shouldn't want it anyways. We should want a caliphate. Yeah. And it's like, it's all a distraction. And in some ways, again, it's also all about hopelessness.
Absolutely.
It's like, well, we've broken the weather. We're never going to be able to fix it. It's like, well, we probably could fix it. If you took the production budget of one Marvel movie. Seriously. You could probably fix a part of an ocean.
Definitely.
Right? If we have the ability to do that, we could. But we don't want to. Yeah. Or certain people don't want to. And we don't want to unite people to put pressure on those people to do it because we're too busy fighting each other.
Exactly.
So that's why we need to be a bit more visionary in this. And that's why for me, I'm a bit concerned sometimes in that we're all being played. So like people are like, oh, the white supremacists are doing this. I'm like, but maybe in us obsessing over the white supremacists and just yelling at them, calling them white supremacists instead of finding out why
or try to explain,
why are they doing this? Yes, like, why are they so upset? Or trying to explain to them, like, you're being played.
Exactly.
Because then we could actually be on the same page and realize, oh, wait a minute, they're trying to divide us.
Definitely.
They're trying to make
polarize like everything.
They're trying to make sure we never see something in common, so we won't work together and fight somebody else. That's what they're trying to do.
Absolutely.
So they're also, not only are they trying to make white people hate me, they're also trying to make me hate white people.
Exactly.
And we all have to be careful about that.
Absolutely.
Because I can be really angry and I can call out racism, I can call out white privilege, that sort of thing. But I can't dehumanize that other person. Absolutely. That's dangerous.
Whenever you know the other person's history or circumstances.
Like, they're being an idiot, but the truth is I have the capacity to be an idiot too. Like, we all have the capacity to be very oblivious to our privilege. Absolutely. We all do. So, like, and if everyone's very similar to you, it's going to be even harder to unlearn that stuff. So that's why I really try to focus with people, like, again, going back to what I was trying to do with Muslim Link, it's like, Muslims have to go back and look at the ways in which we discriminate against each other and other people before, like, I'm not saying before, but we have to do that at the same time in which we're calling out other people's discrimination. That's because how can you teach somebody you never learned yourself? If I've never unlearned something,
definitely.
How can I teach other people to unlearn something?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And it actually leads me to the other question, which is, how did it happen? When did you become Muslim?
I have no idea how it happened. I always like to say I became Muslim by osmosis. Because again, rationally it makes no sense. I was an atheist. I became an atheist at 8 for humanitarian reasons. That's why I have a lot of sympathy towards people who become atheists. I just have a problem with atheists who preach atheism because I feel like that's basically just a real religion then. Like, I feel like your atheism is a religion. Stop making it like it's not a religion. It's a religion now. If you want everyone to be an atheist, that's a religion now.
Absolutely.
Right? Whereas I was an atheist because I had a problem with the supremacy aspect of religion. Also, I had a problem with the idea that, like, God controls everything. Because I'm like, well, if God controls everything, then horrible things happen to me, and God let them happen. What is he a sadist? Like, what's wrong with him? And that's a legitimate question that I feel like a lot of people do not answer.
It is a legitimate question.
Like, a lot of people do not answer those questions, and also, like, so people say, like, everything happens
for a reason. They're much more divert to something else.
Yeah, and it's like, that's a hard question. Like, why do bad things happen to good people? Like, that's a very hard question, and it's something like, and also the problem is, like, if you've had some sort of happy little sheltered life, and you act like you can answer that question for a person who's, like, lost everything, you're an idiot. Yes, don't definitely do that. So myself, like, in terms of how I came to Islam, was that, I had conversations about religion with people who've really gone through some stuff. It was like women who were refugees who lost their country, had lost people, like, had gone through some really scary stuff, which a lot of them, we'll never even fully talk about, because a lot of refugee women don't talk about everything that they've gone through in a civil war and when they're escaping something. Right? Yeah. But they've gone through stuff. So then they were able to talk about their faith and even the things they would emphasize in the faith of Islam. I was like, okay, that's completely different than the religion I was taught by my friends. I had Muslim friends in high school. Some of them are still my friends. Like, one of them is still like a close friend. And the way they taught Islam to me, I was like, so it's like Christianity, but even more arrogant. Okay, it's like Christianity, but you can be a big rich person. Okay, and then be like, I'm gonna give all my charity. Like, I remember even, like, the stupidest thing I would hear, because again, as somebody who grew up poor, I was like, they'd be like, yeah, I fast during Ramadan so I could feel like it's like to be poor. I'm like, what do poor Muslims do during Ramadan then? Basically. You idiot. Like, I'm just like, I guess they stop themselves from being angry at you. That you honestly think like this is the experience of poverty. But everyone knows you're going to be binging food and watching Arabic soap operas, all night. Shut up. Like, just shut up. So, I mean, I had nothing against it. Like, I wasn't Islamophobic.
Yeah. But you made right points, actually, about, yes, definitely.
But I was like, I'm not interested in this.
Yes.
It doesn't speak to me. But when I started tutoring for refugee families that were Muslim, the moms would talk about Islam in this very different way. And the things they would emphasize in it, I was just like, this religion's very interesting. Particularly around, like, because even around things about justice. Because, again, one of the things I've always had an issue with some forms of Christianity is this idea that, like, God can forgive you for everything you've done. Where I was like, no. God can forgive you for stuff you've done to God. If you've messed with somebody else's life, absolutely, that person. Yes. So I really like this idea. And I find, like, not all Muslims know this, but, like, it's part of the religion that we're sort of like, in the afterlife, all the blessings you've accumulated, if you've messed with somebody's life and they didn't forgive you, it's all good. Like, it's such a basic...
It's going to be a transfer.
It's going to be a transfer of goods. It's a very interesting trade-based capitalist transaction, you know?
Basically.
But it's such a good way... Like, I feel like this needs to be emphasized more. And I mean, I've worked with Muslim kids and I'm realizing, they're not getting this part. Because if you get that part, you realize this is why you can't beat people. This is why you can't try to invade people's land and take their stuff. Like, you have to be very, very careful about your intentions.
Exactly. Right? And interactions with people.
Yeah, it's like, because there's going to be a debt. And it's not just Muslims who can get that from you. It's everybody.
That's a great point.
Right? Sometimes it can even be an animal.
Exactly.
So y'all going down, like, we're all going down, actually. So I really liked that because I had grown up experiencing incest from my grandfather and just, like, and really abusive things. So when you experience that kind of thing, you really want there to be some sort of judgment.
Absolutely.
And you also don't want to be told to forgive everybody. Like, I mean, Islam says, say it's great to be forgiven, you'll get a lot of blessings for it, but you don't have to. And I like that because, like, it's because I feel like a lot of times the thing around forgiveness is actually used to manipulate, victimize people, and protect the victimizers. And so they would emphasize those sort of things, and then they'd also emphasize, like, I just found different passages in the Quran that were really fascinating. Like, you know, like, there's a whole passage in the Quran about, like, not forcing slave girls into prostitution. But then it also says it's like, but know that, because it's sort of understood that they're probably going to be forced into anyways, because, you know, but know that the system's so horrible and is against slave people and slaves, right? But it says, no, that Allah forgives them. And it's like, I like the fact that it's a God that thinks about slave girls, because no one thinks about slave girls. Now, unfortunately, throughout Muslim history, they also didn't think about slave girls. But this isn't the religion. You're not supposed to be forcing them into prostitution. ISIS. I mean, like, because, I mean, what was this? So it's just, so again, like, it was interesting just sort of becoming Muslim, but then also still having a critical eye. So when I became Muslim, it wasn't in a Muslim Student Association context. It wasn't in any of this. But so then when I started, and it was just in my neighborhood, and in similar neighborhoods, like low-income communities, because that's where refugees end up. But then what happened was that when I started trying to get involved in different Muslim groups, I realized I realized that, like, I had become Muslim, but almost I had to protect my faith from these spaces.
Absolutely.
Because they were just like every other religious space that I didn't like. In that, they're like, yay, we're amazing. We're better than everyone else. We're better than the West. I'm like, you're here. In the West. Like, again, I found myself, like, strangely sometimes becoming a bit like, just like, well, you don't like it here, then leave. Like, I mean, it was just, you know, like, which was like I'm being xenophobic now, but you're just like, just stop crapping on the West. Okay? Like, the fact that I'm free to convert to this religion, and it's not going to massively negatively affect my life, because there's no ID cards with my religion on it, is Western. Chill.
And that's one of the other part that I see sometimes in even different communities is that, you know, when even more so, like in Islam especially, is that the view that you have personally as a human being, you try to portray it as the view of the religion that you're from. It can be like in any group of religion.
Well, here's the problem. There's Islamic ideals and then there's Muslim realities.
Absolutely.
And oftentimes I think what we do is we compare Islamic ideals to Western realities.
Basically.
So people are like, well, Muslim women got the right to work and vote and own their own property, you know, long before women in the West did. I'm like, no, they didn't. Ideally, they did, but that didn't actually translate into reality. So shut up. Like, I mean, like, because it's also, like, really dangerous if we keep thinking these things, because it's why, like, when somebody comes up and is like, do you understand what's going on in Iran, or do you understand what's going on in Saudi Arabia, or do you understand like this thing that happened in this part of Pakistan?
Exactly.
A lot of times I find Muslims who've grown up here, they don't literally know enough about what's happened in terms of how Sharia law is implemented.
Yes.
So like, why would people be afraid of Sharia law? I'm like, because this, and this.
Yeah.
So, like, do you understand your own religious jurisprudence? Do you understand how it's been used to, so the biggest thing is always with slavery, and that's why I found, like, a lot of, there's very little interfaith dialogue with Black people in Canada.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of them will bring up the slave thing. And they'll be like, well, you guys, it's like, no, you guys enslaved us too.
Yeah.
You did.
You did. Even before.
You did it before. That's why there was this whole thing. Like, that's why you have an anti-Black racist narrative in Islam. It's because you were enslaved Black people.
Exactly.
So you did it long before white people even were white. And then also, it got ramped up out of the Ottomans. And there was actually two forms of slavery. There were slaves of Blacks and slaves of whites. And there was two slave girls. So, like, Tunisia in the 19th century was able to abolish the enslavement of Black people. But why did they do it? Because it ends up that a lot of the Black people getting enslaved were actually Muslims.
Basically.
And people so racist, like, well, I'm just going to take any Black person I randomly see. It's like, what? So, like, that's a part of our history. And just like how we see how that kind of anti-Black racism still and history of slavery affects the United States. You think it's not affecting the Muslim world? You think it doesn't affect countries like Tunisia or Mauritius or Mauritania, that, like, or all these things? It's like, of course it does.
Even up to now, sometimes even like personally, when we're talking about religion and I express my views and sometimes like mention Islam and stuff like that, so you Muslim? I'm like, yeah, because I'm not Arabic. I don't have a huge.
It's so bizarre, right? Like, I mean, one of my former students, again, I'm so proud of them. Like, they made this really interesting documentary, which I'll send to you, about their experiences with anti-Black racism at University of Ottawa from people from the Muslim Student Association. But, like, it was really weird because, like, they were Somali, and so the people like, oh, you're not black. You're not like Black people like from Rwanda. And so, like, you're not black. You're not like Black people from Rwanda. And it's like, and they're like, what? And it's really great because like, they're talking about that, and then like they're overlaying like people in Rwanda who are praying because there are Muslims in Rwanda. Yes. And it's also like, what do you mean by that? Or even like, and then they do an interview with somebody who's Nigerian, and she's just like, yeah, I was like in the Masala, and I was just reading from the Quran. They're like, oh, you know how to read the Quran? And they're like, yeah.
Of course.
It's like, how long, like, so there's this, and again, I think it's important to explore those things because it's like, again, when people get like weirded out when white people don't know about something, it's like, your community doesn't know stuff too. Like, we're all ignorant in these really creepy, annoying ways. If you only think it's white people like that, it's so dangerous. And it also means you will dehumanize them in a way where you start looking at, oh wait, people in your own community are just the same, even worse in some cases, because they really should know better, but they don't. Because it's like, you keep talking about how Islam's around the world, it means it's everywhere. And it's spread to some of these places longer, like, in some cases it's like, it's spread into Africa just earlier than it's spread into parts of the Middle East or South Asia. So, but again, it's been interesting how this has informed like a lot of the anti-oppression work I do, because I think it's made me less focused on it's made me more focused on anti-oppression versus just one thing over another. It's made me definitely also more focused on anti-Black racism, because when you realize that you're experiencing anti-Black racism from everyone everywhere in the world, it's a global phenomenon. You're like, wow, that's scary.
It puts a lot of things into perspective.
And you're like, but it's also like, okay, I'm scared of all y'all. Like, I'm just like, because it's like, it's like as a Black person, you travel anywhere. Like, it's just, you're going to have the same issues in China as you might have in India, as you might have like whatever. And so it also, because I think one of the more disturbing early experiences I had was actually with a group of Black Muslims who were playing me a cassette by a prominent Black Canadian Islamic speaker who was talking about how, like, as Black Muslims we shouldn't call, and it wasn't Nation of Islam, it was Sunni Islam, but how we shouldn't call another Black person our brother because they eat swine and drink alcohol. And I remember just looking around being like, so did I just join the Nazis? Because my white mom raised me to see every Black person as my brother, and that's generally how they've seen me, because we got to survive this place. I don't know what you're trying to teach me right now. This is messed up. So those elements, I think what's been interesting for me, that I've stayed Muslim for 17 years is that I've been able to see, I've been able to find the truth in the religion for myself.
Absolutely.
And try to protect that from, try to find other people who see the same way.
Absolutely.
But that's also why I just don't ascribe to one space or whatever, because I realize it's just you never know what's going to happen there, and people can seem all really nice in one way, but then say something really weird, and you're like, yeah, I can't deal with this, because I don't want to lose. Like, I think we need to understand that, like, my faith in Allah is not going to change, but we have to be careful with how people are going to see the relationship with Muslims, and so we have to be so much more mindful of trying to deal with these issues so that people just don't feel alienated from the community. At the same time, though, one thing I would say that's been positive is that, like, I don't believe Islam is a private faith. Islam is very much like you have to be Muslim with other Muslims. And again, it goes back to this issue of mental health, because I really believe that, again, you improve yourself from interacting with people who you have very little in common with.
Yes.
Because it can cause conflict, but it also can cause empathy, and recognizing that actually, no, I have a bias. Like, sometimes, for myself, like the person I work with who's a publisher of Muslim Link, I had all these biases against him. He's an Arab guy, was Syrian, who grew up in Saudi Arabia, could probably pass as a white guy, like pass as an Italian at least, and like I just had all these ideas of like a Muslim guy, because again, I've been Muslim, but I generally don't interact a lot with Muslim men, particularly not who are my age and younger, unless they're like little boys. And I had all these biases, but he's actually been more supportive of me than all these progressive people. So that's the great thing about being in community, is that you're forced to unlearn your own biases.
Absolutely.
And I believe that's why Islam is very clear that, like, you can't be Muslim by yourself in a monastery. You gotta be with people. It makes you less egotistical. It makes you realize your shortcomings. And it makes you realize the diversity of humanity, because I think that's a problem right now. The way we live right now is like you might have your immediate family and you might have your coworkers, but in the end, you only surround yourself with people you like. That's not how the world works. You have to surround yourself with people that you care about, even if you don't like them. And that's the benefit of being part of a religious community. It's like we have this sense of care. We don't really like each other, but we do want the best for each other, and we have to learn how to work together to achieve that.
Absolutely. And it's actually one of the whole idea of this podcast, which is the community bringing together different faith, no faith, or whatever. But as you mentioned earlier, being with the other shows you your own shortcomings, but it shows you that, there are other opinions, there are other perspectives, and when it all comes together, we can just get better as a community. And
I think also, like, and again, this sounds a bit morbid, but it's not as a Muslim, like, this idea of death. In fact, they're all going to die, which, is in many ways, in a religious context, that's one of the most important things. The idea that we're all supposed to go to each other's janazas if we can, that we're all, like, their funeral, that sort of thing. Because I always think any petty thing gets put into perspective when you realize, okay, but if this person died tomorrow, would I feel really bad if I didn't resolve this right now? I probably should try to resolve this right now. And so I feel like that's the other element of religion, is that it puts that life part into perspective. It's like, this is all very temporary. You might want to weigh your priorities in terms of, like, is this fight really necessary right now?
Absolutely.
And I'm still learning that myself. I'm still not great at that myself, but it's definitely the thing that I'm kind of really focusing on right now, is just like that element of, as Muslims, we're not supposed to fear death. How can that become something that's not a death cult, but actually a way of really embracing life, but also really becoming much more empathetic and compassionate and helpful, because you realize it's like, wow, we don't have very long. It's kind of a rough time.
Exactly.
So let's just not waste our time trolling.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in this beautiful message, I thank you very much again. And I'm sure we have much more to talk about, maybe on another session. And thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Please share, subscribe, and review. Also, you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. And until next time, never forget, you're as unique as the universe. Peace be with you.